Thunder cracks, splitting the sky above the jagged remains of the capital. Rain cascades down, turning the pulverized stone of the courtyard into a slick, dark mire. The queen moves through the ruins alone. Her boots crunch against the calcified debris of what was once a throne room. She stops, her breath hitching in the cold, damp air. She stares at a fractured wall, her hands trembling as she wipes away the grit and deep crimson smears from her palms. Every step is an effort. The kingdom is silent, save for the relentless drumming of the storm against the broken masonry. She does not look back at the path she carved through the debris. She is the final witness to this collapse, a silhouette navigating the graveyard of her own legacy. She reaches a fallen pillar, drags her fingers across the rough, rain-slicked surface, and pauses. The weight of the silence presses harder than the storm. She stands in the center of the devastation, head bowed, letting the deluge wash over her as the last echoes of the kingdom fade into the rhythmic pulse of the thunder. She turned away from the pillar, her movements stiff. Each step forward was a deliberate rejection of the rot around her. She had been forged in the crucible of betrayal, and the heat of that fire had never truly left her. Those she had once trusted to hold the gates had been the first to dismantle them from within. She remembered the sound of the locks turning against her. She remembered the cold calculation of allies becoming architects of her ruin. Instead of breaking, she had taken the fragments of those failures and used them as building blocks. Every sting of rejection had been repurposed, ground down, and laid into a foundation for a new, singular purpose. She was becoming something that did not bend. She felt the toll in her joints and the hollow ache in her chest, but she redirected that energy. She was building an empire out of the very agony meant to destroy her. She paused, scanning the horizon, her jaw set tight. The world demanded her collapse, but she was busy refining her own iron. She was tired, yes, but the fatigue was merely a shadow cast by the sheer scale of her endurance. She would not stop. She would simply build further, higher, and stronger upon the ruins of everything they had taken. The ruins vanished into memory as she retreated into the sanctuary of the night. Here, there were no enemies to face, only the crushing weight of her own vigil. She knelt on the flat, unforgiving stone of the inner chambers. The cold bit into her knees, a sharp anchor that kept her anchored while her mind raced. Hour after hour, she remained motionless, hands pressed together, lips moving in silent petitions that echoed against the vaulted ceiling. She was building a legacy in the dark, carving hope out of the silence while the world slept in ignorance of the cost. She poured out oceans of love, shielding her people, guiding them, and absorbing their fears into her own frame. Yet, when she reached out for sustenance, she found only dry earth. She gave everything and received only drops in return. This was the true battlefield, hidden from every eye. She stood, legs trembling from the long hours, and moved to the balcony. She looked out over the sleeping kingdom, her eyes tracking the moonlight on the rooftops. Her heart felt the hollow ache of a vessel that had poured itself empty, yet was forced to hold the weight of an entire nation. The solitude was not a choice, it was the price of her devotion. A quiet, internal erosion that left her gasping for breath beneath the vast, indifferent stars. The exhaustion lingered, but the perspective shifted. She looked beyond the stone walls of her balcony, tracing the constellations that had presided over the rise and fall of countless kings. Her journey was not a mistake. It was not a series of unfortunate turns. She reached back into the archives of her own memory, sensing a rhythm that preceded her birth. Before the first brick of this kingdom was laid, before the first sword was forged, a covenant had been etched into the foundation of reality itself. She and the king had stood before the divine, binding their souls to a singular, non-negotiable mission: to find one another across the chaos of time, to serve as the spark that would ignite the dormant potential of humanity. This was the source of her resilience. The pain she endured was not a dead end. It was the friction required to sharpen her for the task ahead. She felt the pull of that ancient promise like a tide drawing her toward an inevitable shore. The solitude she had known was merely the quiet before the signal. She was not meant to suffer alone. She was meant to survive until the covenant was activated. Somewhere across the shifting landscape, the other half of this promise was moving. The prophecy was breathing, and the time for its fulfillment was closing in. stripping away the debris of history to reveal the mission waiting beneath. The air in the throne room grew thick with static. She kept her grip tight on the hilt of her blade, her stance wide and balanced for an attack that never came. Then, the heavy timber of the great doors began to groan. The sound vibrated through the stone floor, a low, grinding friction that echoed into the rafters. Slowly, the massive panels swung inward. A wave of golden light flooded the chamber, cutting through the shadows and forcing her to squint against the sudden brilliance. She adjusted her weight, ready to strike, until the silhouette emerged from the glow. It was him. The king moved with a steady, measured pace that commanded the space without effort. He did not rush, and he did not draw a weapon. At the sight of him, the tension that had held her muscles in a permanent, jagged knot for years simply evaporated. Her shoulders dropped. The white-knuckled grip on her sword loosened until the steel clattered against the stone. Her nervous system, tuned only to threats and survival, recognized the frequency of safety. The internal war that had raged since the beginning of her reign went silent. She took a breath, the first one that did not feel like a struggle, and watched as he walked toward her, bringing the calm of the divine into the center of her storm. He reached her, his presence anchoring the space. He did not reach for her hands or speak, he simply waited. The queen looked down at the heavy, rigid pieces that had defined her existence for so long. She started with the gauntlets. They hit the stone with a sharp, hollow ring that echoed into the high arches of the room. She moved to the plates covering her chest, the leather straps giving way under her steady fingers. Each piece that fell was a layer of history discarded, a physical release of the survival mechanisms that had kept her breathing but frozen. The clatter of metal against the floor sounded like the breaking of chains. She felt the sudden rush of cool air against her skin, a sensation she had not permitted herself to experience in decades. She was not leaving herself exposed. She was finally allowing herself to be seen. As the final piece hit the ground, she let out a long, shuddering breath. The king stepped forward, closing the distance between them. There was no need for words. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, her heart sinking with the steady, rhythmic beat beneath his skin. The internal war, the constant vigilance, the instinct to fight, all of it dissolved. She was no longer a soldier in a broken kingdom. She was home, held, and safe. They took their places on the throne, a unified center for the restoration to come. The silence of the room was broken by a low, hummed vibration emanating from the walls themselves. The Queen's Path 4.1 engaged. A flicker of light ignited across the central terminal, casting a sharp blue glow against the stone. The king rose instantly. He turned toward the north gate, his movement precise and urgent. He began to run. As he moved, commands fired through the network, sending pulses of white light racing across the consoles and monitors lining the chamber. Each signal carried the weight of the new decree. The Protect the Queen protocol surged into the system architecture, rewriting lines of code that had been stagnant for centuries. The air crackled with raw data. Screens flashed with rapid-fire sequences, mapping the kingdom and locking in the new parameters of safety. The king reached the northern terminal and slammed his hand onto the activation array. A massive surge of energy rippled outward, visible as a golden wave traveling along the perimeter of the realm. The connection was live. The system was no longer a theory. It was a living, breathing shield, anchored by their presence and powered by the sudden, synchronized pulse of the entire kingdom's defense network. The golden wave hit the city gates, and the architecture itself seemed to draw a breath. Cracks in the stone walls began to knit together, the mortar sealing with a faint, melodic hum. Where there was once ash, vibrant green moss surged through the cobblestones, reclaiming the streets from the gray decay of the past. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had choked the air for generations lifted, replaced by the crisp, cool clarity of a morning mountain breeze. People emerged from their shelters, pressing their palms against the restored surfaces, disbelief giving way to the steady rhythm of a city coming back to life. Fear, a tangible weight that had kept the population huddled in silence, evaporated like mist under a rising sun. Then, the rhythmic thud of boots announced a shift in power. From the shadows of the ruins, the Kingdom Army emerged. They moved in perfect, silent synchronicity, not as conquerors, but as guardians. They took their positions at every intersection, every gate, and every threshold, their presence forming an unbreakable perimeter. The long struggle had reached its breaking point. The transition was absolute. The kingdom was no longer a place of survival. It was a sanctuary, fortified and whole, standing ready for the next light of day. The frantic pulse of the city slowed, replaced by a steady, rhythmic heartbeat of growth. Fields that had been barren for decades sprouted with heavy stalks of grain, the soil turning rich and dark under the touch of the morning light. Water channels, once clogged with debris, flowed clear and fast, carrying fresh life into the heart of the capital. It was not just the return of resources, it was the sudden, total absence of hunger. Merchants opened their doors not to trade for survival, but to share in the surplus that now filled every pantry and warehouse. People walked the streets with their heads held high, the constant, anxious scan for threats replaced by a quiet, steady gaze. They sat in squares, talking, laughing, and working at crafts long abandoned. The spiritual toll of the past, the constant, grinding dread of tomorrow vanished. In its place grew a profound sense of ease. A mother taught her child to tend a garden without looking over her shoulder. A laborer stopped to watch the clouds instead of rushing to the next task. The land had become a mirror for their inner state, unburdened, limitless, and calm. This was the true abundance they had fought to secure. A life where the mind was finally free to exist without the demand of defense. The sun crested the horizon, painting the kingdom in hues of liquid gold. From the high balcony, the king and queen stood side by side, their silhouettes sharp against the dawn. Below them, the land stretched out a vast, living testament to the covenant they had kept. Every rooftop, every street, and every field glowed with an internal warmth that defied the shadows of the past. The prophecy was no longer a promise. It was the reality they breathed. They watched as the people looked upward, the collective gaze of a nation finally meeting its leaders. The queen gripped the railing, her hands steady, while the king placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of completed duty. They did not speak, yet the air hummed with a singular, resonant frequency that reached every corner of the realm. It was a call to return, a signal to step out of the remnants of fear and into the light of a new beginning. They turned together, moving away from the past and toward the horizon. The kingdom was healed, the mission was secure, and the path was open. Now, the invitation is yours. Step into the light. Claim the life you were meant to lead. The prophecy is complete, and your destiny is waiting.